The Galactic Combat Academy of Valoris had seen warriors from 47 species walk its polished obsidian floors. Cantharians with their triple-jointed limbs. Dravik soldiers whose skin was naturally armored plating. Solvex hunters who could sense heartbeats from 3 corridors away. None of them had ever made Wa feel uncertain. Until Joe walked through the admission gates. Wa stood at the observation deck above training floor 7, arms folded behind his back, for eyes narrowed as he watched the new batch of recruits assemble below. He was the Academy's most feared instructor, a title earned not by cruelty, but by absolute, unforgiving standards. Recruits either became warriors under his watch, or they became civilians who had learned a very expensive lesson about self-awareness. He scanned the lineup. A Dravik youth, already broad as a doorframe. 2 Cantharian twins, their 6 arms twitching with pre-combat energy. A Solvex female, golden-eyed and coiled like a spring. And then, the human. Wa's upper right eye twitched. She was small. Even by human standards, which were already considered modest by galactic norms, she was small. Barely 160 centimeters. Slight frame. Dark hair pulled into a plain knot at the back of her head. She wore standard-issue Academy grays that looked 2 sizes too large, and she stood with her hands loosely at her sides, head slightly bowed, like she was waiting for a transport, not preparing for combat evaluation. Joe. He had read her file. Age 19. From a mid-rim human colony called Adensa. No military lineage on record. No formal combat certifications. Health evaluations showed a minor structural irregularity in her left shoulder, an old injury, poorly documented. The recommendation committee had flagged her application 3 times. 3 separate reviewers had written, in their own words, variations of, "This candidate does not appear combat suitable." Wa had overridden them personally. Not out of charity. He had learned, across 200 years of training warriors, that files could lie in both directions. He would know in the first hour. The evaluation began with baseline sparring, species matched against similar weight class where possible. Joe was paired with me, a junior Cantharian cadet who had already completed 1 semester and was being used to baseline new recruits. Me was not unkind, but she was efficient. She'd knocked out 3 recruits in previous evaluations before they'd had time to process what happened. The other cadets watched from the sidelines. Some whispered. New York, the Dravik youth, made a sound that was the rough equivalent of a suppressed laugh. Hi, the Solvex female, simply watched with flat golden eyes, neither dismissive nor impressed. She was the only one who looked genuinely uncertain. Me stepped forward into stance. A Cantharian ready position, weight distributed across 3 of her 4 legs, 2 arms raised, 2 arms held low and back, prepared for either grapple or strike depending on what her opponent opened with. Joe looked at her. Then Joe moved. It wasn't fast, at first. It was almost slow, a single step forward, her left foot sliding out at an angle, her weight dropping fractionally. Me processed it as a basic human step-in. She committed to an early intercept, 1 high arm sweeping to redirect whatever Joe intended. Joe wasn't there. She had pivoted on the ball of her left foot, inside Me's reach, not outside it, and her right arm was already rising, not to strike, but to guide, 2 fingers pressed gently to the inside of Me's elbow, redirecting the sweep's own momentum. Me stumbled 1 step. Joe was already behind her, hand light on the back of Me's shoulder, and with the softest possible application of downward pressure. Me was on the floor. The training hall went completely silent. Me lay on her back, blinking all 4 of her eyes rapidly, which was a Cantharian expression of total cognitive surprise. She had not been hurt. She had been redirected, her own force, her own motion, turned against her with such precise minimal interference that she'd had no opportunity to compensate. Joe stepped back. Stood with her hands loose at her sides again. Head slightly bowed. Wa descended from the observation deck. He did not run. He walked with the measured pace of someone who had learned never to show urgency unless he intended it as a weapon. But inside, something that hadn't moved in decades was moving now. He stepped onto the floor. The other recruits parted. Cadet Joe. His voice carried. What was that form? Ethrin redirection, sir, Joe said. Her voice was quiet. Not timid, quiet in the way that a blade in its sheath is quiet. Third discipline. It uses the opponent's committed force as the primary driver. Effective against larger opponents because size becomes a liability when momentum is already extended. Ethrin is an extinct combat discipline, was said. The last practitioner died 80 years ago. I know, sir. I found the archived manuals on the Interstellar Historical Combat Preservation Network. They weren't translated. I learned Old Cantharian to read them. Silence. Day was senior assistant instructor, standing at the far wall, made a small movement that was the Solvex equivalent of an eyebrow raise. Will looked at Joe for a long moment. Then he said, simply, show me something else. What followed was not a demonstration. It was an unveiling. Joe walked through forms the way a musician might walk through scales, not performing, but thinking, her body the instrument of something internal and precise. She demonstrated Tarek ground grappling, a style developed by a species with no skeleton, adapted by her somehow for a body that had bones. She demonstrated Veth-Solon striking, a discipline so dependent on accurate reading of biological tells that most non-Solvex practitioners considered it practically unlearnable. She demonstrated human boxing, human wrestling, human Muay Thai, and 3 variants of human sword forms translated into empty hand movement. Then she stopped. Stood with her hands at her sides. Head slightly bowed. Where, was said, and his voice was different now, lower, careful, the way you speak when you are in the presence of something you do not yet fully understand. Did you train? Mostly alone, sir, Joe said. My colony didn't have a combat program. I built a simulation room and a storage unit when I was 12. I started with everything I could access digitally, and I just kept going. Your shoulder, was said. The old injury. Joe's chin lifted slightly. I dislocated it badly at 14. It didn't set right because we didn't have proper medical resources. I spent 2 years relearning every form I knew to compensate for the limitation. That's when I started understanding that most forms weren't actually designed optimally, they were designed for the species that created them. I started adapting. You adapted combat doctrines from 47 species, Day said from across the room, and her voice carried an edge that was either skepticism or something close to reverence. 43, Joe said. I haven't finished the other 4. That night, was stood alone on the observation deck. Below, the training floor was empty, lit only by the ambient blue of the facility's overnight lighting. He had spent 2 centuries believing he understood the nature of warriors. That greatness came from physical gifts, from lineage, from species advantages that accumulated over evolution, armor, speed, sense, strength. He had met prodigies before. He had seen gifted beings from a dozen species who seemed to exceed what their body should allow. But he had never, in 200 years, encountered what walked through his gates today. A human girl from a mid-rim colony with no military tradition, no formal training, no biological advantages the galaxy didn't already have more of, who had, alone, in a storage unit, decided that she would understand all of it. Every discipline. Every doctrine. Every extinct art and living tradition. Not to collect them, but to know them, to carry them inside her body as naturally as breathing. The galaxy had a habit of underestimating humans. It was an error so common it had become a kind of background noise. Joe had simply used that noise as silence to work in. He pulled up her file on his console. Found the field marked, recommend for advancement. He typed a single word, immediately. Then, below it, in the notes field, something he had not written for any recruit in 40 years. Watch this one. Not because she will need supervision. Because in 20 years, the rest of us will be reading her manuals. Down in the barracks, Jo sat cross-legged on her bunk. She wasn't sleeping. She had a data tablet open, filled with annotated diagrams, the fourth of the 4 remaining combat doctrines she hadn't finished adapting yet. Her left shoulder ached faintly, the way it always did at the end of a long day. She rolled it gently, felt the familiar catch and release, and kept reading. There was still so much to learn. She had always found that comforting. HFY, because when humanity can't match them in size, speed, or strength, we do what we've always done, we study until we understand it better than they do.